Brett McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. The Battle of the Bulge commenced on the morning of December 16th, 1944. The Allies were ill-prepared for this last desperate offensive from the Germans, and the campaign might have succeeded if a few things hadn't gotten in their way, including a single, green, 18-man platoon who refused to give up their ground to the Nazis. Alex Kershaw shares the story of these men in his book, The Longest Winter, and with us today on the show. He first explains the background of the Battle of the Bulge and how an intelligence and reconnaissance unit that had never seen combat ended up in the thick of it. And he describes the platoon's 20-year-old leader, Lyle Bouck, who was determined to carry out his orders and hold a position despite being massively outmanned and outgunned, and how his men fought until they were down to their last rounds. Alex then shares how what Bouck thought was a total failure, being captured as POWs after just a day of combat, turned out to have been an effort that significantly influenced the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, and how an unlikely platoon of heroes who initially went unrecognized for their valor became the most decorated American platoon of World War II. You'll find such an inspiring lesson in the show about living up to your duty and holding the line. After the show's over, check out our show notes at aom.is/Battle of the Bulge. All right, Alex Kershaw, welcome back to the show.
Hi, great to be with you.
So we're coming up on the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. That'll be next year. And you wrote a book 2 decades ago about the Battle of the Bulge. It's called The Longest Winter. And what I love with your books that you do about World War II is you always find a small story. You find a individual soldier, a unit that you can talk about the stories of these individual people in the broader context of this epic conflict that happened with World War II. And in this story, you follow an 18-man platoon from the U.S. Army. They are facing the main thrust of the entire German assault at the Battle of the Bulge. How did you come across this story?
Well, I had written a book called The Bedford Boys that appeared in 2003 and did fairly well. That was about D-Day, focusing on a company that had been activated, first of all, as a National Guard unit from one small town in Virginia, Bedford. And anyway, my editor said to me, can you pick another small group of guys and thrust them into the middle of a very big battle in World War II? And the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge is coming up. Maybe you could find a unit that accomplished amazing things during the Battle of the Bulge. And I just put a phone call through to a friend of mine who worked at the Eisenhower Center in New Orleans, University of New Orleans. And I said, look, I'm looking for a small group of guys, like the size of a football team, maybe ideally. And I'm looking at the Battle of the Bulge. Can you make any recommendations about any unit that I could look at? And he's like, immediately said, INR platoon in the 99th Division, commanded by a 20-year-old called Lyle Bouck, and here's his telephone number. And I literally, a few hours later, called up Lyle Bouck. This is over 20 years ago now, almost 20 years ago now. And he answered the phone. He was in St. Louis, and he answered the phone. And I said, look, I really don't want to disturb you, but I'm really keen on writing about you and your platoon. And he was okay with it. I was like amazed that he was very polite and agreed to me writing about him and his platoon, but he had one condition, which was that I had to write about every single member of the platoon that was there that day on the 16th of December, 1944, first day of the German attack during the Battle of the Bulge. And, to cut a long story short, that platoon became the most decorated of World War II, most decorated U.S. platoon, I should add. And I gave him my word. I said, yeah, okay, I'll do my very best to write about every guy in the platoon. And of the 18 that served in the Battle of the Bulge, I think there were 11 still alive when I began my research. And I managed to interview all 11, amazingly. And not one of them is breathing today as I speak to you.
I mean, I imagine that's one of the hard things with your jobs. You started writing about World War II right when a lot of these guys were still alive, but those numbers have been dwindling every year.
Yeah, I started interviewing seriously World War II veterans in the late 90s, and 16 million Americans served in uniform in World War II, and there are less than 120,000 alive today. So you'd have to be 98, 99 to have served in World War II. I mean, some people lied about their age. I met a guy just a few days ago who was actually 16 during the Battle of the Bulge. He's a guy called Harry Miller, but he lied about his age. But you'd have to be 98, 99, and there aren't many 98, 99-year-olds around. But that's the youngest you could be, So yeah, there are very few of the dozens and dozens of World War II veterans that I interviewed who are still with us,
So we're going to talk about the story. Lyle Balk, he's an amazing character, amazing person, and we're going to talk about his story and what he did with his unit at the Battle of the Bulge. But what's interesting about your book doesn't start at the Battle of the Bulge. It actually starts in July of that same year, of 1944, in the Wolf's Lair. And this was Hitler's Prussian headquarters. Why start the story of the Battle of the Bulge here?
Well, I wanted to start with a really dramatic scene, and that was the planting of a bomb by Count von Stauffenberg. It was what ended up being a failed assassination attempt of Hitler, one of many. But it really shook Hitler up. It wounded him badly. He was injured, almost killed by the blast. It was in a conference room that was actually had open windows. So if the windows had been closed and it hadn't been, things could have been otherwise. Hitler could have been easily killed. But anyway, after that, he started to think about how he might change the course of the war. And in the following months, a couple of months after that July assassination attempt, he developed what became known as Wacht am Rhein, the code word for an attack through the Ardennes in December of 1944. So I wanted to start with this very dramatic moment when a Prussian aristocrat leaves a bomb in a suitcase and almost kills Hitler, and then examine how Hitler, after that near-death event, in desperation, developed a plan that he hoped would end the war on his terms in the West, that would change the outcome of World War II. So I also wanted to meet my platoon members before they shipped out from the US. So I switched from Hitler's near death to Camp Maxey in Texas, where the INR platoon were being trained under the leadership of Lyle Balk, who was then just 20 years old. So that's how I started. And then they get shipped out to the UK, and I believe the early fall of 1944, and then arrive in Belgium in November of 1944. And they were literally on the line for just a couple of weeks before the battle erupted. Totally green troops. It's supposed to be an elite unit. An INR unit is an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. They're not supposed to be engaged in heavy combat. Quite the opposite. They're supposed to be the eyes and ears of a infantry regiment. If they're spotted and they end up in a firefight, that's bad news, because they're supposed to be patrolling secretly, unobserved behind enemy lines and feeding intelligence back to regimental headquarters. So, when they were attacked on the 16th of December, they were not a standard infantry unit. And it was only because they had great leadership and they'd brought in a couple of extra 50 cal machine guns and mounted them on jeeps that they had any real firepower. So yeah, that's how I started with Hitler, and then following these guys to the front lines in the Ardennes.
Okay, so yeah, put this in the bigger context. Hitler at this point, the Nazis, their backs were against the wall. This is after D-Day.
Yeah.
The Allies were making progress in France, and then we're heading into Germany. And as you talk about in the book, this assassination attempt, it wounded him, it kind of shook him up, but it also, in a weird way, enlivened Hitler. He kind of started liking his own supply. He's like, I'm awesome. Look, they didn't kill me. I'm invincible. So maybe I can do this. And then he started looking at portraits of Frederick the Great and kind of talking with Frederick the Great, saying, I can do what you did. And that's how he came with this final attack.
Yeah, and basically he hadn't been killed, and therefore he thought that Providence or God had saved him for greater things and that fortune was on his side. So yeah, that's how he developed his actually very daring and really quite audacious plan at what became known as his last great gamble, in the West.
So yeah, then after that, you switch over to Camp Maxi, to this unit, this platoon. Like you said, they're a reconnaissance platoon. And you talk about how the guys who were selected for this unit, they were handpicked. What were the characteristics that the leaders were looking for this INR platoon?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because a fair few of the guys had never expected to be in combat. They'd been in a special training program for, college kids, what were called whiz kids, where they were, heading towards positions in intelligence units or some kind of duty that was not in a foxhole on the front lines. But because of the manpower shortage in the fall of 1944, the ASTP program, as it was called, was cancelled, and all these guys that were, they very smart, highly educated guys were sent into infantry units, and much to their dismay and disappointment. And so several of the guys in BAUK's intelligence and reconnaissance platoon were very smart, very highly educated, and didn't want to be there, but hadn't had much choice. So they were a formidable bunch. They came from all over the United States. They came from different backgrounds. They were a diverse group, different ethnicities. They were, truly an all-American unit in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you had, one Vernon Leopold. He was a German Jewish refugee, part of this unit. You had, I think it's Hernandez, a Mexican immigrant in there as well. Yeah, from all over.
Yeah, there was a guy called Milosevic who, for those who remember the Bosnian War, his distant relative was Milosevic in recent times. So he was a Serbian, the son of Serbian immigrants. So Hernandez, the guy you mentioned, he was, he had grown up in Texas. I actually managed to interview his widow in El Paso when I was researching the book. Guys from the Midwest, from cities, from rural America, a couple of really good athletes. So it was a real mixed bunch, a really interesting range of Americans that Lyle Bauk was commanding. He was the second youngest in the platoon. There was a guy called Bill James who was 19 years old, who was his runner. But imagine that, you've got 18 guys that you're in command of, and you're the second youngest. So, and you haven't seen combat before, and you look like a kid. I mean, Lyle Bauk looked very young. So the question is, why should any of these guys pay you any respect or carry out your orders when you've never been at war and you look like a boy? So,
right. Well, and Bauk has an interesting background. I want to talk about him because he's a big part of the story.
Yeah.
So he was young. He was 20 years old, but he actually he got involved in the military when he was 14, I think, with the National Guard.
Yeah, he joined the National Guard when he's 14. I think I have a photograph in the book or somewhere else, but where I show a picture of him when he was just 14 in a whole group of other guys in the National Guard. And, so he was very patriotic, and it wasn't just because he received some pay when he turned up for drills, etc. He was from the start. He wanted to serve his country, and by the time he got to Europe, to the Ardennes in the fall of 1944, he'd actually been wearing a uniform for almost 6 years. So it wasn't like he just came out of high school and ended up as a lieutenant. He went through officer training school. He was seen as having great potential by his commanding officer, a guy called Major Kreese, and felt really proud that he'd been sort of singled out for leadership potential and given command of this INR platoon. It was a big deal to Lyle Bauk. He felt very honored by that.
Did he show potential for a capacity for leadership?
Yeah, he did, definitely. Yeah. I mean, you go through officer training school, they can work out pretty quickly whether you have what it takes to lead guys. Well, you never know, though. I mean, this is the big issue, which is that it doesn't matter how well trained you are. When the bullets start whizzing by, only then do you know whether you've got it or you haven't. And that's something that every combat veteran will tell you, that it's not until you actually get into combat that you realize who you are or what you can do, or whether your leaders are any good or not. That's always a big question mark, So you've got 18 guys under this young man's command. None of them know either what will happen in combat, because none of them have been in combat before either. So lots of questions, when people start to try to kill you, how do you react? And they all found out on the 16th of December.
Okay, so this unit, they get shipped to Europe. And when they were in Camp Maxi, they didn't know where they were going yet. I think you see this a lot in a lot of these World War II stories. These guys are at camp, and then they get the order to load up in a train, and they're on the train, and they're like, all right, is this going to go east or is this going to go west?
Yeah.
Because if it goes east, we're going to go to Europe. If it goes west, we're getting shipped off to the Pacific Theater. And the same thing happened with these guys. They didn't know until they got on the train and it started heading east.
Yeah, and I would say that by that stage of the war, by the fall of 1944, most GIs would much rather go to Europe than the Pacific, because the Pacific was just it was a different kind of war. It was much darker, much more brutal. Japanese refusing to surrender, just a really atrocious, barbaric series of islands you have to hop from one to another. And I think most GIs thought that, if they were fighting against the Wehrmacht, if they're fighting against even the SS, Hitler's, most devout followers, that they stood a good chance of being taken prisoner, that they might not be beheaded, that, if the worst came to the worst and they did end up as POWs, that they could survive the war. Whereas, the idea of being taken prisoner by the Japanese in the Pacific was almost as horrific as fighting them.
Okay, so they end up in Europe and they end up in Belgium in the Ardennes forest. When this is late November, early December. Give us an idea, because I think maybe people have seen Band of Brothers, the Battle of the Bulge scene, like it was cold, wet. I mean, give us an idea. What were the elements like in this area? What were they up against?
Well, they were in kind of very hilly terrain in the Ardennes, very thickly forested areas, and then some pasture. But it was the coldest winter in living memory. So, people always look at movies like The Battle of the Bulge and Patton, and you see those beautiful couple of episodes from Band of Brothers. I think they're my favorite. And it does look extremely cold. In fact, it was colder than usual. So people weren't kidding when they said it was literally, people were freezing to death. If in foxholes, unless you hugged your foxhole buddy to share their body warmth, or you took really serious precautions, you did stand a good chance of not waking up, of being frozen in your foxhole. So we're very cold. For the first few days of the Battle of the Bulge, the skies were overcast. It snowed in different areas. And then finally the skies cleared at the 23rd of December after about a week. But the conditions were miserable. You were out there not getting hot food, subsisting on K rations, having to spend every night in a foxhole. Maybe you had a blanket over you, and if you were lucky, to cover the foxhole, and you wake up and it would be like stiff as wood in the morning. And you did that night after night after night, and it was extremely exhausting. It was very, very, very harsh indeed, and you were constantly worried about getting trench foot. There was mud, slush, just a very, very difficult fighting conditions. In fact, probably some of the most difficult of World War II. In the Pacific, there were horrendous conditions, but I think the Battle of the Bulge, every veteran will tell you that the thing they remember most is just how goddamn cold it was,
Yeah, and in addition to the harsh weather conditions, the troops they were inadequately supplied, and they were just generally unprepared in a lot of ways for a big attack.
We were running out of men in the fall of 1944. So because of the broad front strategy pursued by the Allies, which meant that we had a front line running from the Dutch border right through to Italy, was thinly manned. We didn't have enough divisions to put on that very long front line, and the Ardennes was the most thinly manned part of that broad front. The divisions that were there were green. They hadn't seen combat before, or they were being rested after the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, which was a real meat grinder. So thinly manned, not seen combat before, harsh conditions, and not expecting an attack. The position of the Allies in late fall of 1944 was that they were going to man this line and then gather new infantry regiments, material and other supplies, and then launch a spring attack into the heart of the Third Reich. They had no idea, absolutely no idea, the average soldier, that is, that the Germans were capable of launching such a massive surprise attack. And in fact, although intelligence suggested that some kind of attack could occur at the very highest levels of the Allied command, the attack took them completely by surprise. I mean, it was stunning. I mean, it caused panic and chaos. Over 200,000 Germans suddenly attacking you in a place that you least expected in really difficult terrain. They did not expect that at all. Quite the opposite.
How are they able to hide that? 'Cause, I mean, at this point, hadn't we cracked the Enigma? And so we were able to decipher codes and things like that?
Well, very good point. And that goes to a broader issue, which is that we over-relied on having broken the German codes and Enigma information. We kind of got lazy. We thought we knew everything the Germans were up to. But before the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler had stated that there should be no radio communication, that orders should be written by hand, that those who knew about the plans for the battle were to keep it within a very tight circle. Anybody found relaying information about the forthcoming plans was to be executed. And the way that the Germans actually gathered those 200,000 soldiers and, over 500 tanks, over 1,000 artillery pieces, how they gathered them along the front line in the Ardennes is one of the great achievements of Hitler's forces in World War II. It was miraculous almost. The Germans strafed Allied positions to cause a distraction while tanks and other men moved to the front lines. They did so after dark because they could be spotted by Allied air forces during the day. They muffled the tank tracks. They had vehicles go over straw that had been laying on roads. They made sure that the ammunition, in many cases, was carried to the front by hand, again, trying to avoid being spotted in vehicles. They even went so far as to ban soldiers from having fires with wood. They used charcoal instead so that they wouldn't create smoke, so that we couldn't spot them. Everything was done in utmost secrecy and to avoid detection. So, they did a superb job of gathering those forces in all three armies, well over 200,000 troops gathered. And when they attacked at 5:30, that was 0 hour, 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of December, they took everybody by surprise. I should add to that there were intelligence reports coming back to the Allies that strongly suggested that some kind of attack was in the making. The INR platoon itself, Laubach's platoon, had detected strange noises and had reported back that something was going on. But at high levels, there was a really serious complacency. They just thought the Germans were incapable of launching this kind of scale of attack, that they were really a spent force in the West, and didn't see it coming and didn't expect it.
Who was leading the attack on the German side?
The overall commander was von Rundstedt. He was the overall German commander. And then you had various Wehrmacht divisions and then SS divisions. The main strike force, the spearhead of the German attack was to be entirely SS. So, SS stands for Schutzstaffel. That's Hitler's private army. They're above the law. They are responsible for carrying out many of the atrocities of the Second World War committed by the Germans. They ran the concentration camps. And within the Waffen-SS, which is the army SS, if you like, they were the troops that Hitler trusted most toward the end of the war, especially after a Wehrmacht general, von Stauffenberg, had tried to kill him. So Hitler didn't trust his Wehrmacht generals, the standard army officers and generals, didn't trust them, and therefore the main responsibility for success in Wacht am Rhein, in the attack in the Ardennes, that rested on the shoulders of SS officers and generals, and in particular a guy called Jochen Peiper, who was in command of what was called Kampfgruppe Peiper. That was a task force, special task force that went ahead of an SS Panzer army and was tasked with breaking through American lines and reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours. So really, the success of the campaign, of the battle, rested just on one guy's shoulders, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Peiper, who led that spearhead of SS troops that attacked on the 16th of December, and he was told, you got to get here by this time, don't mess around, don't take prisoners. If you get there, then we've got a chance. If you don't, the war's lost. So huge responsibility for anybody to be carrying on their shoulders. And without jumping too far ahead, Joachim Peiper, almost managed it. It was mission impossible, but he almost got there.
We're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. And now back to the show. Okay, so let's talk about the Battle of the Bulge. So it started December 16th, 5:30 in the morning. How did it start? When did Bauck realize? Because again, Bauck is like in the middle of this. Like he's at the front line, him and his unit, they're there. They had seen some German soldiers in the area, but they didn't know there was a big attack coming. When did they realize, oh my gosh, this is a big giant attack?
Well, the barrage that preceded the attack that began at like 5:30 was one of the biggest barrages of the Second World War. So the Germans just shelled the hell out of all the American positions along. The front line would have been around about 50 miles long. The northern shoulder of what became the Battle of the Bulge was manned by the 99th Infantry Division. In the center, you had the 106th Infantry Division and then the 28th Infantry Division. And to the south, you had other American forces that both of those shoulders on the north and the south, they performed pretty well. They withstood, incredible pressure. But the south, the center of the line folded pretty quickly. So the first time that Bauck knew what was going on was when, the skies lit up at 5:30 and he and his platoon all jumped into their foxholes and took shelter. It was a very, very powerful barrage, and that was the same all along the line. So that the barrage was the first, it was the wake-up call, the signal. And then after that ended, around about 8 o'clock in the morning, the front lines of the German attack, the advanced troops started to break through American positions. And it was around about that time in the morning that the INR platoon spotted their first Germans, who were paratroopers that had been sent ahead of Joachim Peiper's SS troops. The paratroopers were there to sort of, it was believed, mop up very light American resistance because the barrage would have done its work. The lines were thinly held. It was hoped that there would be so much chaos and confusion and panic that there would be very insignificant American resistance. And that actually was, in many cases, that happened to be true, but they didn't count on Lyle Bauck and his platoon carrying out their orders, which were to hold their positions at all costs.
And that's what they did. They did, and again, they just had their rifles, and they had that 150 caliber on a Jeep.
Yeah, they actually had. I think they had two 50 calibers, and then M1 rifles, and Bauck would have had a carbine, which was the standard issue for an officer. But so yeah, they manned positions above a small village called Lanzerath, which was right in the middle of the northern part of the shoulder, but more importantly, it was overlooking a road which the Germans had labeled Rollbahn B. That means Route B. And that was the route that Joachim Peiper was going to take to break through American lines and hit his objectives. So they happened to be in the worst possible place at the worst possible time, just 18 of them in the platoon, and they were confronting a force of several hundred paratroopers, and then behind those paratroopers were Joachim Peiper's SS troops and dozens and dozens of Tiger and Panther tanks.
What's really amazing about this story is that under that kind of pressure, right, being so outnumbered, so outgunned, Bauck and his men, they would have been really tempted to run, to retreat, but they didn't. They stood their ground.
Yeah, I mean, when he got the orders, he decided to carry out his orders, but there were several guys in the platoon that weren't quite so happy about that because they thought they didn't stand a chance, that they were up against this massive force, and that what difference did it make if they went down fighting and took a few dozen or whatever with them? Some of them thought maybe it would be a better idea to pull back and regroup and form a better line of defense. That why sacrifice their lives for really no good reason? They were massively outnumbered after all. But Lyle Bauck was a good officer, and an order was an order, and he told his men that we're staying, and no one's going to leave. later in the day, when they got into really serious combat, they were attacked actually in all 4 times by the Germans and held their positions. But later in the day, as the situation became increasingly hopeless, he did say, if you want to go, you can go. I'm staying, but if any of you guys want to go, you can go and, try and escape the German penetration and join other Americans and fight another day. But none of the platoon actually did that. They all stayed put. There were many cases in the first hours, the first couple of days, in fact, of the Battle of the Bulge, where the Americans did turn and run. That was understandable. They were, petrified. They were up against a much greater force, and they turned tail. And that may have been a lack of courage, or it may have been very sensible, because they wanted to carry on fighting, and they thought by retreating they might stand a better chance of putting up a good fight. So, but that was not the case with the INR platoon. They stayed where they stood, and they fought extremely well.
Yeah, you wrote about Bauck. He returned to this place in 1969, and you said that he realized perhaps the one factor above all, their youth, had explained why he and his men had stood and held. That older men, fathers, wiser, more cautious adults would surely have retreated as soon as the Germans appeared in such superior numbers. So his youth probably played a role in that.
Yeah, and I think he was, this is the first day of real combat. I mean, they'd been patrolling behind enemy lines, that had a few close shaves, but they actually hadn't engaged with the enemy before. So this was the first true test. And I think Lao Bao wanted to prove himself. He was young. Everyone was watching him, looking at him, thinking, well, what's this guy got? And he wanted to show that he had the right stuff. And he did, They were attacked frontally. They were on a hillside near a tree line. Foxholes are still there. You can actually go. I was back there in May. I went to Lao Bao's foxhole. So they were along the tree line, well placed, and Bauck had done his best to reinforce the positions. He'd done what he could, and the paratroopers that attacked them were badly led, and they ran at them across an open field, open slope. There was a barbed wire fence that bisected the field, and as they were trying to climb over the fence, the 50 cals literally just mowed them down. I mean, some people say that there were 500 Germans that were killed or wounded. Some people say it's more like 3 or 4 dozen. It doesn't matter. What did happen was that 4 times the Germans attacked up this hillside near the village of Lanzerath, and these 18 guys in the INR platoon repulsed them every time. They're running out of ammunition by the time it was all over. It was like sort of getting dark around about 4:00 in the afternoon. People forget just how long darkness lasted in that part of the world. In December 1944, you almost have 16 hours of darkness. So got light around about 8:30 in the morning, got dark around 4:30 in the afternoon. And by around 4:00 in the afternoon, many of the platoon were literally down to their last rounds. They'd been firing in firefight for most of the day. A couple of them were seriously wounded, and miraculously only just a couple. But literally, they with a few more minutes, half an hour maybe, it would have been dark, and they had nothing left to fight with. And so it was at that point that Bauck said, if you want to try and get away, now's the time to do so under cover darkness. He still was going to stay. And then finally, the paratroopers got smart and realized that these full frontal assaults up this hillside were disastrous, and they decided to try and outflank the platoon's positions. And so they came in from the flanks through woods and started to seize each of the foxholes. And the way they did that was that they fired at them, they threw grenades, and then when they got close enough, they would shout out, in German, get out, or raus, raus is what they actually said, get out. And they literally pulled several of the platoon members out of the foxholes by hand. And these guys, didn't give up easily. They, in a couple of cases, they literally had fired their last rounds.
And what role did this stand that Bauck and his unit they made that day? What role did it play in the Battle of the Bulge for the Allies?
Well, with Bauck, what happened was that he was beside Bill James, his runner, in his foxhole, and suddenly the barrel of a machine pistol was thrust through a slit at the front of the. They created a really good a well-defended command post and covered it with logs. And so there was a slit about 2 or 3 feet wide by maybe 6 inches high, and suddenly the barrel of a German machine pistol came through, and it was pointed right at Bauk. And instinctively, he didn't have time to think about it. Instinctively, he pushed it to the side, and the German opened fire and fired, unfortunately, right into Bill James's face. So unbelievably, Bill James wasn't killed, but he took a lot of rounds in his face. Later on, I think he had to have over 20 plastic surgery operations to try and repair his face. Really badly disfigured and bleeding everywhere at the time. Bauk thought he was going to die very quickly. So Bauk was pulled out with James. James is in and out of consciousness. Bauk doesn't surrender quickly enough put his hands in the air rather after it's been pulled out of his hole and is shot in the leg. And then he has to try and prop up his buddy, Bill James, who was a good friend of his too, and is marched down the hillside towards a cafe in Nazareth. And, he passes German corpses. The barbed wire fence is sort of piled high with dead or dying Germans or bleeding Germans. And as he's staggering down this hillside after dark with a German pointing a gun in his back, he hears this click and he thinks to himself, "Oh, the guy's shot me. I'm dead. This is what happens when you're dead. I'm dead, but I'm still on this hillside." But in fact, it was just the German messing with him, trying to scare him by pressing the trigger on his empty barrel. At least that's what our theory is today. So to cut a long story short, none of the platoon were killed. There was a forward artillery observer that was attached to the platoon. There were 3 guys, I think. There were forward artillery observers that found themselves in the position that day, and a guy called Gacki was killed. So he was the only fatality. But none of the actual platoon were killed. A couple of them seriously wounded. Obviously Bill James really had his face almost blown off. And they're put in the Cafe Scholzen, which is the building's still there after dark, and Bauk's sitting there with his buddy bleeding out, his uniform soaked in his blood, and he's thinking to himself, okay, I've had 1 day in combat. It was a complete and utter disaster. I carried out my orders, but I've got 2 of my platoons shot up, and we're all going to be prisoners of war. What a great achievement. I think less than 24 hours of my first day of real war, and I messed it up completely. And so he was very, they were sent into POW camps at a very bad time to be sent into POW camps in the Third Reich, when there was very little food and the Third Reich was collapsing. They weren't treated particularly well. They lost a lot of weight. And all throughout that winter and the spring of winter 1945 and spring of 1945, Bauk was haunted by what had happened in Lanzerath. He felt like a complete failure. He felt like the one thing he'd wanted in his life since he was 14 was to serve as an army officer and to, win honor and maybe not glory, but to do his duty. And he felt like he completely failed and was very depressed. It's depressing being a POW anyway. It wrecks your mental health. But he felt like he'd really had achieved nothing and had failed miserably. And so it was only many years after the war, in the 60s, when Bill James, who did survive the war, even though his face had been, almost blown off, he went into surgery in the Third Reich and was operated on without anesthetic, etc. And German doctors managed to save his life. But in the 60s, Bill James read a book by John Eisenhower, who was Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower's son. And John Eisenhower wrote a book called The Bitter Woods, which was about the Battle of the Bulge. I think it was published in 1965. And it was a really good in-depth study of what had happened during the Battle of the Bulge. And in it, he recounted the actions of the platoon. He interviewed Bill James and others that were in the vicinity. And, Bill James read the book and he called up Lyle Bauk out of the blue and he said, "You know what? I know that you've always felt that we shouldn't talk about this. We shouldn't, revisit that terrible time. But in fact, what we did was amazing because we actually held up the main strike force, the spearhead of the German attack during the Battle of the Bulge. And by holding our positions, carrying out the orders, doing our duty, even though it seemed insane and pointless at the time, we delayed Piper's strike force by maybe 24 hours. And that 24 hours that was a very critical time that we threw the SS off their timetable, and if you've only got 48 hours to get somewhere and you lose 24 hours, then you got real problems. And that's exactly what happened. Piper was delayed by the INR platoon, by other units too, but predominantly by the INR platoon's actions that day. And that totally messed up the critical German schedule and made a big difference to the outcome. Eisenhower argued, and others would argue, to the outcome of what happened on the first and second day of the Battle of the Bulge, which was the really important point of that battle. There were objectives that had to be reached. If they weren't reached, the battle, yes, it would continue, but ultimately it would fail. It was all about getting somewhere quickly in the first 48 hours. And so, James said that, what we did was amazing. We were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but boy, by carrying out our orders, we actually made a big, big difference to that vast battle. And it is the biggest battle ever fought by the US Army in World War II. Almost 800,000 Americans involved in some way. I think the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the First World War may have come close, or historians can argue about which was the larger number of men involved, but it was certainly the most lethal battle for the US in World War II. More Americans were killed in the Battle of the Bulge than any other single battle in World War II. I think some 19,000 lost their lives. It lasted from the 16th of December through until officially the 16th of January. The Bulge in the Allied lines was erased at Houffalize. So it's a month-long slugfest and very high casualties, 19,000 deaths, a very bloody, difficult battle indeed. So yeah, they made a big difference. They made a really big difference to that last great battle on the Western Front in World War II.
So you mentioned John Eisenhower wrote a history, and he concluded that Bauch and his platoon, they played a big role in giving the Allies time to regroup from the surprise attack. But the thing is, these guys, they didn't get any recognition. They didn't receive awards immediately for their efforts on December 16th. Why is that? Why didn't they get any awards?
It was because the importance of their actions weren't recognized until Eisenhower wrote his book that came out in 1965. And then, Bill James called up Bauch and said, we did something quite extraordinary. It was very important, and persuaded Bauch to try and, get some kind of recognition for the platoon. And that was a long, long process. It was a very difficult process, to award medals after an action, long after an action, is very difficult. You have to pass legislation through Congress. You have to have affidavits. It has to be very, very well documented. And to his credit, Lyle Bauch led that campaign because he wanted his men to be recognized. It wasn't in it for himself at all, but he wanted his men to be recognized. And I think that was a way of him coming to terms with that sense of failure that he'd felt. And a public recognition of what his men had actually done would have erased that sense of regret and failure. And so in the late 70s, the efforts to get the platoon recognized succeeded. The platoon were awarded medals, and when you add up all the Bronze Stars with Valor, the Silver Stars, the DSCs for the 18-man platoon, they actually became, for a single action, the most decorated US platoon of World War II. So a long campaign, but ultimately successful. And Lyle Bauch was very proud. Most of the platoon was still alive when they received their awards in Washington, D.C. And I think it was 1978, before the first game of the season, they appeared at Yankee Stadium on the mound, and Lyle Bauch threw out the first pitch, and their names appeared in lights at Yankee Stadium. And it was sort of Hollywood ending. These guys had done their duty, had suffered greatly, had survived the war as POWs, had come back, started families, worked really hard, and then, more than 30 years later, were finally recognized and had their names in lights and had this wonderful, absolutely a Hollywood ending to this very unlikely story.
So as you took a deep dive into the lives of these men, did you get any life lessons from them?
I think same kind of life lessons you get from talking to anybody that has been in combat, whether it's World War II or not, that, the route to contentment lies through service to others. So I think that they all felt incredibly, all of the World War II veterans I've ever interviewed obviously were proud of their service, did not boast about it, did not think they'd done anything particularly special. They did their duty, they served their country, and were just lucky to come home, felt blessed that they did get to come home and have long lives. And I think they also felt very fortunate that they had got to survive, but they'd also been at a moment in world history when their actions had counted, and counted a great deal. In terms of the platoon, that was absolutely the case. They were only in combat for maybe, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, but those 18 men, what they did in those hours really made a huge difference in terms of, us being able to vote today, us being able to live in democracies, in terms of defeating the Third Reich. But those were vital hours. So the life lessons I should have learned by now, and I haven't learned enough, are that, helping other people, being unified, putting aside your differences, working for others, serving others, that's where you get real contentment from. And I think the older you get, the more you realize that you got to find some kind of cause in life that's bigger than your own ego, bigger than yourself. And the best way to do that is to help other people,
Well, Alex, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about your work?
At my website, www.alexkershaw.com. That's the best place to go. Or you can go on Amazon and buy my books, Alex Kershaw, plug it into the search engine. But yeah, just Google me.
Fantastic. Well, Alex Kershaw, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much yet again for having me on your wonderful, you got an amazing podcast there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My guest today was Alex Kershaw. He's the author of the book, The Longest Winter. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find more information about his work at his website, alexkershaw.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/battleofthebulge, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic. Well, that wraps up another edition and another year of the AoM Podcast. Thank you all so much for listening to the show. We know there are thousands of podcasts that you can listen to out there, so it really means a lot that you choose to spend some time with us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your continued support. We really do appreciate it. Also, I want to take some time to thank some people who work behind the scenes here at the show. First, Kate McKay. She's my wife and the producer and editor of the podcast. Kate works really hard to make sure the final episode that you all listen to is the best it can be. And beyond producing the podcast, Kate's also contributed a lot of great articles at artofmanliness.com. So thank you, Kate, for all that you do for Art of Manliness. Also, I want to thank Creative Audio Lab here in Tulsa. They're our sound engineers. They make sure the sound quality of our podcast are the best they can be. So thank you to Dylan and John for all that you do for the podcast. We're taking a break for the rest of the year to celebrate the holidays with our family. We'll be running some rerun episodes. From all of us here at Art of Manliness, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. We'll see you in 2024.